When the wife asked for an important witness to be brought in, husband and mistress froze in shock, not believing their eyes. Grace Thompson sat alone in her living room, the faint hum of the city filtering through the windows. The soft golden light of the table lamp cast long shadows across the bookshelves, but her thoughts were far from the comfort of her surroundings. Her eyes lingered on the clock mounted above the fireplace. 11:42 p.m. Michael was late, again. Her husband had always been charming, his easy laugh and attentive demeanor disarming even in the most tense of situations. It was one of the reasons she'd fallen for him all those years ago. Yet lately Grace felt something slipping away. It wasn't just his late hours or the sudden business trips. It was the small unspoken things that chipped away at her trust. The hurried goodbyes, the hollow reassurances, the lingering scent of unfamiliar perfume clinging to his suits. Grace wasn't one to jump to conclusions. She'd built her reputation on being meticulous and logical, qualities that had propelled her career as a high-profile litigation consultant. But even she couldn't ignore the evidence piling up. And then there was the scarf. It had been a bright lipstick-red thing crumpled carelessly on the passenger seat of Michael's car. Grace had discovered it that afternoon when searching for a misplaced grocery receipt. She'd stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing. The silky fabric was not hers. She would never wear something so bold. And there it was, a faint smudge of crimson lipstick along the edge, as damning as any courtroom exhibit. When the door clicked open, Grace didn't move. Her fingers gripped the edge of the armrest as Michael entered, his footsteps light and confident. He shrugged off his coat and flashed her a tired smile. "Still up?" he asked, setting his briefcase by the door. "Yes," she replied, her voice calm but cool. Michael strolled into the room, loosening his tie. "Work ran late again. Big meeting tomorrow." "You know how it is." Grace nodded but didn't reply. Her silence unsettled him. She could see it in the way his hands lingered as he adjusted his tie. Michael prided himself on his ability to charm, to diffuse tension with a joke or a warm embrace. Tonight his charm would not save him. "Are you okay?" he asked, moving toward her. "I found something in your car today," Grace said, her tone steady, betraying nothing. Michael stopped mid-step. "Oh, a scarf," she continued, her gaze locked on him. Bright red silk with a lipstick stain. For a moment Michael froze. His charming facade faltered as his eyes darted toward the front door as if searching for an escape. "That's probably from one of the clients I drove last week," he stammered. "You know, networking events and all." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Do your clients often leave personal items in your car? And does their lipstick always end up on them?" He laughed nervously, but the sound was hollow. "Elle, come on, you're reading too much into this. It's nothing, is it?" she pressed, standing now, her composure unwavering. "Because nothing doesn't smell like her perfume or have her lipstick on it. Nothing doesn't have you sneaking home at midnight and avoiding my calls." Michael's charm couldn't hide the guilt flickering in his eyes. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Grace, I swear—" "Don't," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his excuses. "Don't insult me with lies." Across town, Vanessa Carter leaned back against the plush seat of her private booth in a dimly lit lounge. The sultry notes of jazz drifted through the air as she sipped a glass of wine. Her lips, painted the same shade of crimson as the scarf Grace had found, curved into a satisfied smile. Vanessa thrived on risk and ambition. She wasn't the type to settle for mediocrity or to play by the rules. It was that very drive that had made her a formidable player in the competitive world of real estate. But Michael Thompson wasn't just a dalliance, he was a project. She glanced at her phone where a single message from him sat unanswered. "Running late tonight. Don't wait up." Vanessa had always enjoyed the thrill of secrecy, but Grace was a variable she couldn't entirely predict. She had seen Michael's wife only once at a charity gala months ago. Grace's poised confidence and sharp eyes had left an impression. She was the kind of woman who missed nothing, the kind who could unravel a mystery with a single thread. It was a challenge Vanessa wasn't sure she wanted to face. Still, she couldn't deny the power she held over Michael. The way he gravitated toward her like a moth to a flame. She relished it, even as she knew the risks. She brushed her fingers over the scarf she'd left behind in his car. A deliberate act of carelessness. She wondered if Grace had found it yet. Back at home, Michael sat on the couch, his head in his hands. Grace stood across the room, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of anger and disappointment. "Who is she?" Grace asked, breaking the silence. Michael looked up, his face pale. "It's not what you think," he began, but the words rang hollow. "It never is," she replied. "But I'm not blind, Michael. And I won't be lied to." He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, the weight of her gaze bearing down on him. For the first time in their marriage, Michael Thompson had no answers. Grace turned away, her heart heavy but her resolve stronger than ever. The scarf had been a revelation, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was merely the beginning. The grand ballroom shimmered with the opulence of a bygone era. chandeliers casting warm light onto polished marble floors and gilded walls. Grace stood near the edge of the room, her fingers tracing the stem of a champagne flute. She wore an elegant navy gown, its subtle shimmer catching the light with every movement. Her hair was swept into a chignon, her makeup understated but flawless. She was a picture of poise and confidence, but inside her thoughts were turbulent. This was the kind of event Michael thrived in. Schmoozing with powerful clients, exchanging pleasantries that masked negotiations worth millions. Grace had accompanied him to countless galas like this one over the years, but tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't here as his dutiful wife. She was here for answers. Michael entered the room a few minutes later, looking every bit the successful executive in his tailored tuxedo. He had a magnetic energy, the kind that drew people in and put them at ease. Grace watched as he made his way through the crowd, shaking hands and sharing laughs, as though nothing in his world was amiss, but Grace knew better. When he finally spotted her, his expression flickered. Was it surprise? Nervousness? He recovered quickly, his signature smile returning as he approached her. "You look stunning," he said, leaning in to kiss her cheek. "Thank you," Grace replied, her tone cool. "You're late. Sorry about that. Got caught up with some last-minute work," he said smoothly. "You know how it is," Grace arched an eyebrow. "Yes, I do." Michael's smile faltered for a split second, but he recovered quickly. "Let me get you a refill," he said, gesturing to her half-empty glass. "I'm fine," she said firmly. "But I'd like to talk somewhere private." Michael hesitated, glancing around the room as though searching for an escape. "Now? Can it wait until later? This is an important event." "It's always an important event," Grace said, her voice low but sharp. "But somehow I'm never a part of them anymore. So yes, Michael, it has to be now." He opened his mouth to protest but stopped when he saw the determination in her eyes. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "Let's step outside." As they walked toward the terrace, Grace noticed a figure lingering near the edge of the room, Vanessa. The younger woman was striking in a crimson dress that hugged her figure, her dark hair cascading in loose waves over her shoulders. She was speaking to a small group of people, but her attention was clearly elsewhere. Grace's gaze followed the subtle glances Vanessa cast toward Michael, the way her body seemed to angle toward him even from across the room. So this was her. Grace didn't pause or let on that she'd noticed anything. Instead, she kept walking, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she followed Michael onto the terrace. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the ballroom. Grace stepped to the railing, her back to Michael, and took a deep breath before turning to face him. "Who is she?" she asked bluntly. Michael blinked, caught off guard. "What are you talking about?" "Don't insult me, Michael," she said, her voice steady. "The late nights, the trips, the lies, there's someone else, isn't there?" Michael ran a hand through his hair, his composure beginning to crack. "Grace, you're being ridiculous. There's no one else. I've just been busy with work." "Work," she repeated, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Is that what you call her? The woman in the red dress? The one who can't stop staring at you?" Michael froze, his eyes widening for a split second before narrowing. "Vanessa, she's a colleague. That's it. We're working on a big project together. And she's here tonight as part of the team." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "A colleague," she repeated. "Interesting, because the way she looks at you doesn't seem very professional." Michael's jaw tightened. "You're reading too much into this." "Am I?" Grace stepped closer, her gaze unrelenting. "Because if you think I don't notice the way you avoid my questions, the way you flinch every time I bring up your absences, then you don't know me as well as you think you do." Michael sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Grace, I'm telling you the truth. There's nothing going on." Grace stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of sincerity. She saw none. "I hope you're right," she said finally, her voice cold. "Because if you're lying, Michael, I will find out. And when I do, there won't be a place on this earth where you can hide." Inside the ballroom, Vanessa was struggling to maintain her composure. She'd seen Grace arrive and felt a pang of anxiety the moment Michael greeted her. She wasn't naive. She knew Grace suspected something. And now, watching them step onto the terrace together, Vanessa felt the first real crack in her confidence. She forced herself to focus on the conversation around her, nodding and smiling at the right moments. But her mind was elsewhere, imagining the scene unfolding just outside. Vanessa knew she was playing a dangerous game. She had no illusions about the risks involved in her relationship with Michael, but the thrill of it all had been intoxicating. Until now. Now, with Grace so close, Vanessa couldn't shake the feeling that the game was about to take a turn she wasn't prepared for. Grace and Michael returned to the ballroom a few minutes later, their expressions unreadable. Grace said nothing more as she took her place at a table near the center of the room. Vanessa avoided meeting her gaze, but Grace didn't miss the flicker of tension that passed across the younger woman's face. She didn't say a word. Not yet. But as Grace sipped her champagne and watched the interplay between Michael and Vanessa, she knew one thing for certain. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Grace's world, already teetering on the brink, had grown darker after the gala. Though Michael's denials echoed in her ears, her instincts told her otherwise. Her suspicions had crystallized into conviction after observing the glances exchanged between Michael and Vanessa. Their feigned professionalism couldn't mask the connection simmering beneath the surface. Now it was time for action. The morning after the gala, Grace sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea before her. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of the antique clock on the wall. She had spent a sleepless night replaying the evening's events, noting every nuance of body language, every hesitation in Michael's voice. Her resolve had hardened. Michael had left early, as he often did, claiming to have an important meeting downtown. Grace barely looked up as he kissed her cheek on the way out. "Don't wait up," he'd said, his tone overly casual. "I won't," she replied coolly, her gaze fixed on her tea. Once the door clicked shut, Grace reached for her phone and dialed a number she had saved under an innocuous name, Consultant Services. A gruff voice answered after the second ring. "This is Franklin. Mr. Franklin," Grace said, her voice firm. "I need your services. Discretion is non-negotiable." "Understood. What are we dealing with?" She paused for a moment, gripping the phone tightly. "Infidelity. I need to know everything, where, when, and with whom." Franklin's tone shifted, becoming more businesslike. "I'll need some details to start. Send me any relevant information about your husband's schedule, his habits, and the person you suspect." "You'll have it by noon," Grace said. "I expect results quickly." "You'll get them," Franklin assured her. Over the next week, Grace played the role of the dutiful wife flawlessly. She smiled at Michael's jokes, nodded along to his stories about work, and even made his favorite meals. But behind the scenes, she was orchestrating her investigation. Franklin worked swiftly, keeping her updated with nightly phone calls. The first few days yielded little, a few extended lunches and unremarkable meetings. Then, on the fourth day, Franklin called with a breakthrough. "I've got something," he said, his voice low. "Your husband has been meeting a woman at a private villa on the outskirts of town, Vanessa Reed. Ring any bells?" Grace's grip tightened on the phone. "Yes," she said evenly. "That's the woman I suspected," Franklin continued. "The villa's listed under a holding company, but it's clearly been set up for discretion. They've been there twice this week, both times in the afternoon. I have photos and timestamps." "Send them to me," Grace said, her voice like steel. The email came through minutes later, and Grace opened it with trembling hands. The images showed Michael and Vanessa entering the villa, their expressions relaxed, their body language intimate. There was no mistaking the nature of their relationship. Grace stared at the photos, a storm of emotions swirling within her, anger, betrayal, and, surprisingly, a sense of clarity. Now she had proof. As she closed her laptop, an idea began to form. Michael had a family dinner scheduled for the weekend, a rare gathering of his siblings, cousins, and their spouses. The dinner was ostensibly to celebrate Michael's recent success in landing a high-profile client, but Grace saw it as the perfect opportunity. Michael had also been preparing for a major legal case at work, one that involved delicate negotiations and careful reputation management. If she played her cards right, she could expose him in a way that would force him to admit the truth. The evening of the dinner arrived quickly. Grace dressed with meticulous care, choosing a sleek black dress that exuded confidence. She kept her makeup subtle but added a bold red lip, a quiet nod to the lipstick-stained scarf that had set everything in motion. Michael seemed in high spirits as they arrived at the restaurant, greeting his family with warm hugs and easy laughter. Grace stayed by his side, her demeanor poised and pleasant. Vanessa, thankfully, was not present. Grace had made sure of that by confirming with Franklin that Michael had been careful to keep his two worlds separate. The dinner unfolded smoothly at first, with lively conversation and clinking glasses filling the air. Michael was in his element, charming everyone with his anecdotes and basking in their admiration. Grace waited until the main course was served before she struck. "Michael," she said, her voice cutting through the chatter, "I've been meaning to ask you something about your big case." Michael glanced at her, his smile faltering slightly. "Of course, what's on your mind?" Grace set down her fork and leaned forward slightly, her gaze unwavering. "I was curious about how you've been managing your time. You've been working so late recently." "I assume it's all for the case," Michael chuckled nervously. "Well, you know how it is. Lots of late nights, meetings, and planning. It's a demanding project." Grace tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Interesting. Because I've been hearing about a villa on the outskirts of town, quite a secluded place, perfect for private meetings." The table fell silent. All eyes were on Michael, whose face had gone pale. "A villa," he echoed, his voice strained. "Yes," Grace said, her tone deceptively light. "I was just wondering if it's related to the case. Perhaps some sensitive negotiations," Michael stammered, clearly caught off guard. No, I mean yes. Some discussions have taken place outside the office for confidentiality reasons. Grace smiled. A sharp, knowing smile that sent a chill down Michael's spine. Confidentiality. Of course. She picked up her wine glass and took a slow sip, her gaze never leaving his. Michael's siblings exchanged confused glances, clearly sensing the tension. One of them, Robert, broke the silence. "What's this about, Grace?" Grace set down her glass and met Robert's curious gaze. "Oh, nothing much. Just a little curiosity about how Michael juggles his responsibilities. He's quite the multitasker." Michael forced a laugh, trying to steer the conversation back to safer territory. But Grace knew the seed of doubt had been planted. As the evening wore on, Grace played her role flawlessly, offering no further hints about her knowledge. She watched as Michael struggled to maintain his composure, his usual charm dimmed by the weight of her pointed questions. By the time they left the restaurant, Grace felt a grim satisfaction. The cracks in Michael's facade were beginning to show, and she knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Grace had always believed that patience was a virtue. Her life as Michael's wife had taught her the value of timing, of knowing when to strike. Now, with the evidence of his betrayal tucked safely away, she began to prepare the stage for her most daring move yet. 2 days after the family dinner, Grace found Michael in his study, surrounded by stacks of legal briefs. His tie was loosened, and he looked every bit the part of a dedicated professional. But to Grace, his focus seemed strained, his usual confidence tainted with unease. "Michael," she said sweetly, leaning against the doorframe, "do you have a moment?" He glanced up, his expression softening slightly. "For you, always." She stepped into the room and perched on the arm of a nearby chair, feigning casualness. "I've been thinking about your case. It's such an important one, isn't it? High stakes and all that." Michael nodded, though his eyes flickered with suspicion. "Yes, it is." "Why?" Grace smiled, her tone light. "I was wondering if you've considered hosting a dinner. Something elegant but professional. You could invite everyone involved, the clients, your colleagues, anyone crucial to the case. It might help to solidify trust and foster some camaraderie." Michael blinked, clearly caught off guard. "A dinner, that's thoughtful of you, Grace. But I'm not sure it's necessary. We've been handling everything in meetings and calls." Grace tilted her head, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Are you sure? It seems like the kind of gesture that could really set you apart. Plus, it would give me a chance to support you in a tangible way. After all, we're a team, aren't we?" Her words were laced with just enough sincerity to make Michael hesitate. He rubbed the back of his neck, clearly weighing his options. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt," he said at last, though his tone lacked conviction. "But it might be tricky to get everyone together on short notice." Grace's smile widened. "I'm sure you'll manage. And don't worry, I'll take care of the arrangements. You just need to let me know who to invite." Michael nodded slowly, his unease growing. "All right, I'll send you the list." That evening, Michael sat in his car outside Vanessa's apartment, his fingers drumming anxiously on the steering wheel. He hadn't planned on seeing her tonight, but Grace's suggestion of a dinner had unsettled him. He needed Vanessa's perspective, and if he were honest, her reassurance. Vanessa answered the door in a silk robe, her hair cascading over one shoulder. Her usual air of confidence faltered slightly when she saw the tension in Michael's face. "What's wrong?" she asked, stepping aside to let him in. Michael sank into the couch, running a hand through his hair. "Grace wants me to host a dinner for the people involved in the case. She says it'll be good for building trust or something." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "A dinner? With everyone? Yeah," Michael said, leaning back with a sigh. "She's being unusually supportive, which only makes me more suspicious." Vanessa crossed her arms, pacing the room. "Michael, don't you see what this is? She's not being supportive. She's setting a trap. She's probably trying to get us in the same room to confirm her suspicions." Michael frowned, her words sinking in. "You think so?" "I know so," Vanessa said firmly. "She's too smart to let this go. And after the gala," she trailed off, biting her lip. Michael's expression darkened. "What do you suggest, canceling the dinner?" Vanessa shook her head. "That would only make her more suspicious. You'll have to go through with it. But we need a plan. Keep the guest list professional. No one outside of work. And whatever you do, make sure I'm seated as far from her as possible." Michael nodded, though his unease lingered. "All right, I'll handle it. Just be careful, Vanessa. Grace is sharper than she lets on." Vanessa gave him a tight smile, her mind already racing. She had always thrived under pressure, but this felt different. The stakes were higher now, and Grace was proving to be a formidable opponent. The next morning, Grace received an email from Michael with the guest list attached. She opened it eagerly, scanning the names. As expected, Vanessa Reed's name was included, her role as a consultant providing a convenient cover. Grace's lips curved into a cold smile. Everything was falling into place. She spent the rest of the day making arrangements for the dinner, ensuring that every detail was perfect. The venue, a luxurious private dining room at an upscale restaurant, was booked. Invitations were sent, and the menu was carefully curated. As she finalized the seating chart, Grace made sure to place herself near Michael, with Vanessa seated just a few spots away. It was close enough to observe her reactions, but not so close as to raise suspicion. By the time the day of the dinner arrived, Grace felt a strange sense of calm. The pieces were moving, the stage set. All that remained was to see how the players would act when the curtain rose. Vanessa arrived at the restaurant that evening dressed impeccably, her expression composed but her nerves frayed. As she entered the dining room, her eyes immediately sought out Grace, who was greeting guests with effortless charm. Michael was already seated, his demeanor outwardly relaxed but his eyes betraying his unease. Vanessa took her assigned seat, her heart pounding as she exchanged polite smiles with the other guests. Grace caught her gaze briefly, her expression unreadable, and Vanessa felt a chill run down her spine. As the dinner began, Grace played the perfect hostess, engaging each guest in conversation and subtly steering the discussion toward Michael's case. Vanessa watched her warily, every word and gesture scrutinized. For the first time in her life, Vanessa felt like prey in someone else's game. The dinner table was a picture of elegance. Under the soft glow of the chandelier, the clinking of glasses and polite laughter filled the air. Grace sat at the head of the table, a vision of grace and confidence. To anyone watching, she was the devoted wife supporting her husband's professional endeavors. But behind her composed exterior, her mind was razor-sharp, calculating every move. Michael sat a few seats away, a glass of wine in hand. He smiled and nodded at his guests, his charm in full effect. Vanessa, strategically seated 2 places down from him, kept her expression neutral, though the tension in her posture betrayed her nerves. Grace's voice broke through the ambient chatter, light and conversational. "Michael," she began, her tone sweet, "I've been so fascinated by this case of yours. You've been working so hard on it, and I can't help but admire your dedication." Michael glanced at her, his smile tightening. "Thank you, Grace. It's been challenging, but worth it." "You know," Grace continued, her gaze sweeping across the table, "legal cases are often like puzzles, aren't they? So many pieces to fit together. Evidence, arguments, and of course, witnesses." The word hung in the air like a spark, and Michael stiffened ever so slightly. Vanessa's hand, resting on the edge of her plate, clenched into a fist for a brief moment before she forced it to relax. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a tone of curiosity. "Speaking of witnesses, Michael, I couldn't help but wonder, have you considered inviting any key witnesses to join us tonight? It might be beneficial to hear their perspective." Michael hesitated, his confident demeanor faltering for the first time that evening. "Witnesses?" he echoed, feigning confusion. "I don't think that would be appropriate for a dinner like this, Grace. It's meant to be a relaxed gathering, not a courtroom." Grace smiled, her eyes gleaming. "Of course, darling, I didn't mean to suggest otherwise, but you know me, I'm always curious about the people who play such important roles in your work." She let the moment linger, the silence stretching just long enough to make everyone at the table shift uncomfortably. Then, with perfect timing, she added, "In fact, I took the liberty of reaching out to someone I thought might provide some interesting insight, a witness of sorts." Michael's glass paused midway to his lips. Vanessa's fork clattered against her plate. "Grace," Michael said carefully, his voice a touch too calm, "what exactly are you talking about?" Grace's smile widened, the predator circling its prey. "Oh, don't worry, dear. This isn't about your case, it's more personal than that. I thought it might be nice to bring in someone who could shed light on its shared history." The atmosphere at the table shifted, the air thick with unspoken tension. Vanessa's pulse quickened as she exchanged a glance with Michael, who looked like he'd just been doused with ice water. At that moment, the door to the private dining room opened and a figure stepped inside. The guests turned to look, curiosity and confusion written on their faces. Grace rose gracefully, gesturing toward the newcomer. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Caroline Sinclair. She's an old friend of Michael and Vanessa's." Vanessa's face drained of color. Michael's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Caroline, a striking woman with sharp features and an air of quiet authority, stepped forward. Her gaze swept over the room before settling on Michael and Vanessa. "Good evening," she said, her voice calm but with an undercurrent of steel. Grace clapped her hands lightly, her expression one of feigned delight. "Caroline was kind enough to join us on short notice. I thought it would be wonderful to hear some stories from the past." "Michael, Vanessa, you've known her for years, haven't you?" Vanessa opened her mouth to speak but found that no words came. Michael recovered faster, though his voice was strained. "Yes, we've worked together before. Caroline and I go way back." Caroline arched an eyebrow. You could say that, she said coolly, her gaze unwavering. Grace took her seat again, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Caroline, I'm sure everyone here would love to hear about your experiences. You've had such a fascinating career, haven't you? Caroline smiled faintly, though her eyes remained sharp. I have, but I think Michael and Vanessa might have more interesting stories to tell about our time together. The tension at the table was palpable, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Grace, however, seemed entirely at ease, sipping her wine, as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. Vanessa finally found her voice, though it was shaky. It's been a long time, Caroline. I wasn't expecting to see you tonight. Grace tilted her head, her expression one of innocent curiosity. Oh, why not, Vanessa? You and Caroline were such good friends, weren't you? Michael cleared his throat, his voice firm but strained. Grace, I think we should move on. This isn't the time for reminiscing. Grace met his gaze, her smile never faltering. Oh, but Michael, I think it's the perfect time. After all, we're here to celebrate trust and openness, aren't we? The table fell silent, the weight of Grace's words sinking in. Michael and Vanessa exchanged a look, their carefully constructed facade beginning to crack. And Grace, her expression serene, knew she had them exactly where she wanted them. The tension in the room was so thick it felt like a tangible presence pressing down on every occupant at the table. Caroline Sinclair, the unexpected guest of honor, stood at the head of the table, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. She exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that made people sit up straighter and question what they were hiding. Grace sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression calm and poised. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly, and now it was time to let the pieces fall into place. Caroline, she said with a gracious smile, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I know it must have been a surprise to hear from me, but I just couldn't resist reaching out when I learned about your connection to Michael and Vanessa. Caroline returned the smile, though hers carried an edge. It was a surprise, yes, she said, her voice smooth but loaded with subtext. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to reconnect. Michael cleared his throat, his discomfort visible. Grace, he began, forcing a smile. I don't think this is the right time for a reunion. Caroline and I worked together years ago, and Vanessa, well, she was a mutual acquaintance, Caroline interrupted, her gaze flicking to Vanessa. The younger woman sat rigid in her chair, her face pale. Yes, we were all acquainted, Vanessa said quickly, her voice tight. Grace leaned forward slightly, her expression one of polite curiosity. It must be wonderful to catch up after all these years. Caroline, I'd love to hear about your time working with Michael and Vanessa. It sounds like you all had such an eventful past. Caroline's smile deepened, and there was a glint in her eye that sent a chill down Vanessa's spine. Oh, it was certainly eventful, she said, her tone laced with meaning. Michael was always ambitious, and Vanessa, well, she had a knack for finding herself in interesting situations. Vanessa's hand tightened around her wine glass, and Michael shot Caroline a warning look. But Grace was unbothered, sipping her own wine as if this were nothing more than a friendly gathering. I remember one project in particular, Caroline continued, ignoring the unspoken tension. It was high stakes, involved a lot of late nights. She paused, her eyes locking on Michael. Isn't that right, Michael? Michael shifted uncomfortably, his usually confident demeanor beginning to crumble. Caroline, I think we're getting off topic here. This dinner is about family and unity, not ancient history. Grace tilted her head, her smile never wavering. But history is so fascinating, isn't it? Especially when it helps us understand the present. Vanessa shot a pleading look at Michael. But before he could speak, Caroline pressed on. You know, Grace, one thing I always admired about Michael was his ability to juggle multiple priorities. A legal career, a wife, and a colleague. Quite impressive, wouldn't you say? The words hung in the air, their implications unmistakable. The other guests exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that this was no ordinary dinner conversation. Grace set her glass down carefully, her movements deliberate. That does sound impressive, but tell me, Caroline, what about Vanessa? I'm sure she was a great help during those busy times. Vanessa's composure finally cracked. Grace, I don't think this is the time or place for these kinds of questions, she said, her voice trembling. Oh, but I think it is, Grace said, her tone still light but with an undercurrent of steel. After all, this dinner is about transparency, isn't it? Caroline leaned back in her chair, her gaze shifting between Michael and Vanessa. Transparency is important. And speaking of transparency, there's something I've been meaning to ask. Michael, Vanessa, do you remember the project in Savannah? The color drained from Michael's face, and Vanessa looked as if she might faint. I don't think this is necessary, Michael said, his voice tight. But it's so relevant, Caroline countered smoothly. You see, Grace, the project in Savannah wasn't just about long hours and hard work. It involved some questionable decisions. Decisions that might have consequences if they ever came to light. Grace's expression didn't change, but her eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Is that so?" she said softly. Michael stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough," he snapped. "Caroline, you're out of line." Caroline remained seated, unflinching. Am I just saying what you're too afraid to admit?" Vanessa looked like she might burst into tears, and Grace decided it was time to tighten the noose. "Michael, sit down," she said, her tone firm but calm. "Caroline is our guest, and I'm sure she has more to share." Michael hesitated, his fists clenched at his sides, before reluctantly lowering himself back into his chair. Grace turned back to Caroline. "Please continue." Caroline's smile returned, sharper than ever. "Well, let's just say that the Savannah Project wasn't just a business venture. It was a turning point, a moment when personal and professional lines were blurred." Vanessa buried her face in her hands, and Michael looked as if he were on the verge of an outburst. Grace, meanwhile, remained the picture of calm. "Thank you, Caroline. This has been enlightening." Caroline raised her glass in a mock toast. "To transparency," she said, her voice dripping with irony. Grace clinked her glass against Caroline's, her smile never faltering. "To transparency." The rest of the dinner passed in a strained silence, the tension at the table almost unbearable. But Grace didn't mind. She had planted the seeds, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth fully unraveled. Vanessa couldn't wait for the night to end. As soon as the dinner guests dispersed, she slipped away, heart-pounding, searching for Caroline. The woman had lingered after most of the others left, chatting casually with Grace near the doorway. Now Vanessa caught sight of her in the garden, her silhouette illuminated by the soft glow of lanterns. "Caroline," Vanessa called, forcing calm into her voice. She hurried down the cobblestone path, her heels clicking like a metronome of dread. Caroline turned, her lips curving into a sly smile. "Vanessa, what a surprise!" Vanessa stopped in front of her, the cool night air doing little to soothe her overheated nerves. "We need to talk, alone." Caroline raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Of course. I was wondering when you'd come crawling." The words stung, but Vanessa kept her composure. "I don't know what Grace told you to bring you here tonight, but this stunt of yours needs to stop." Caroline leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "Oh, Vanessa, I wasn't brought here. I came of my own accord. You might be surprised at how much I already know." Vanessa's jaw tightened. "Whatever you think you know, it doesn't concern you. You're dredging up things that don't matter anymore." "Oh, but they do matter," Caroline said, her voice dangerously soft, "especially to Grace. And to the authorities, should it come to that." Vanessa's pulse quickened, but she masked her fear with indignation. "You don't know what you're talking about, and you certainly don't have any proof." Caroline tilted her head, studying her like a predator sizing up its prey. "Don't I?" Vanessa stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Listen, Caroline, we both know you're doing this for attention or for revenge, but you don't have to go through with it. Whatever Grace is offering, I can do better." Caroline's smirk deepened. "Better? How intriguing." "Go on." Vanessa swallowed hard. "Money, connections, whatever you want. Just keep your mouth shut for a moment." Caroline seemed to consider the offer, tapping a finger against her chin. Then she laughed, a sharp, cutting sound that sent a chill down Vanessa's spine. "Oh, Vanessa," she said, her amusement fading into something cold and unyielding. "You think you can buy my silence? That's adorable. But here's the thing, I don't want your money, and I certainly don't need your connections. What I want is the truth to come out." Vanessa's mask of confidence cracked. "You don't understand what's at stake." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Caroline said, her voice now a razor's edge. "And so will Grace once I tell her everything." Vanessa's panic turned to desperation. "If you do this, it'll destroy more than just me." Michael made his choices," Caroline interrupted. "And so did you. Now it's time to face the consequences." With that, Caroline turned on her heel and strode back toward the house, leaving Vanessa standing in the garden, trembling with rage and fear. Inside, Grace had just poured herself a glass of wine when Caroline returned. The witness looked pleased with herself, her sharp eyes gleaming. "Did Vanessa come to grovel?" Grace asked, her tone light but her interest keen. Caroline chuckled, taking a seat across from her. "Oh, she tried. Bribes, threats, the usual." Grace set her glass down, leaning forward. "And what did you learn?" Caroline's smile faded slightly, her demeanor turning serious. "Vanessa's desperation isn't just about the affair. There's something else, something darker. She's hiding more than you realize." Grace's brow furrowed. "Go on." Caroline hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "Vanessa and Michael weren't just meeting for their illicit rendezvous. They've been involved in some questionable business dealings, money laundering, possibly embezzlement. And that's just scratching the surface." Grace's breath hitched. She had suspected Vanessa was ambitious, even ruthless, but this was far worse than she'd imagined. "Do you have proof?" "Enough to raise red flags," Caroline said. "And I'm willing to help you uncover the rest." Grace sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore, it was about unraveling a web of deceit that could ruin more than just her marriage. Meanwhile, Michael paced his study, running a hand through his hair. The dinner had been a disaster, and now Vanessa's frantic phone call had confirmed his worst fears. Caroline knew too much. "We're screwed, Michael," Vanessa hissed through the phone. "She's going to tell Grace everything, and if she digs deeper, she'll find out about Savannah." Michael's stomach churned. "Calm down, we can handle this." "Handle it how?" Vanessa snapped. "Caroline won't back down, and Grace is not stupid. She's already putting the pieces together." Michael clenched his fist, his mind racing. Vanessa was right, Grace was too clever to let this go. And Caroline was a wild card he couldn't control. "We need to stay united," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "If we turn on each other, we're finished." Vanessa's laugh was bitter. "United? Don't kid yourself, Michael. When push comes to shove, you'll save your own skin." Michael didn't respond, his silence speaking volumes. And in that moment, both of them realized the same thing. The cracks in their alliance were growing, and it was only a matter of time before everything shattered. Grace sat across from Caroline in the quiet stillness of her sunlit conservatory. The morning light filtered through the glass walls, casting warm golden hues across the room. Yet the atmosphere between the two women was anything but serene. "I want every detail," Grace said, her voice steady but tinged with steel. "Not just about Michael and Vanessa's relationship, everything you know about their extracurricular activities." Caroline sipped her coffee, her expression contemplative. "Vanessa's ambition runs deep, Grace. She's not just after your husband, she's using him. She has connections, people who wouldn't think twice about breaking the law for a price." Grace's heart clenched, though she forced herself to appear calm. "And Michael, how much does he know about her schemes?" Caroline hesitated, then shook her head. "That part's unclear. Vanessa has a way of keeping people on a need-to-know basis, but I'd wager he knows more than he lets on. Enough to be complicit, if not fully involved." Grace felt a surge of anger, but it wasn't just directed at Michael. It was aimed at herself for not seeing through him sooner. "Then we'll need proof, evidence that ties them both to whatever illegal activities she's orchestrating." Caroline's lips curled into a small smile. "I thought you might say that. I've already started digging." While Grace and Caroline plotted, Michael sat in his office staring blankly at his desk. The papers in front of him, once the center of his meticulously organized world, now blurred together in a meaningless mess. His phone buzzed, jolting him out of his stupor. It was Vanessa. "What do you want?" he snapped, his patience long gone. "Nice to hear from you too," Vanessa replied, her tone sharp. "We have a problem, Michael. Grace and Caroline are working together." Michael's grip tightened on the phone. "And whose fault is that, Vanessa? You brought Caroline into this mess." "I didn't bring her into anything," Vanessa retorted. "She inserted herself thanks to your oh-so-clever wife." Michael pinched the bridge of his nose, a headache pounding at his temples. "This is getting out of control. We need to figure out a way to contain this." Vanessa's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I already have a plan." Michael froze. "What kind of plan?" "The kind that ensures neither Grace nor Caroline can threaten us again," Vanessa said, her words laced with menace. Michael's blood ran cold. "Vanessa, don't do anything stupid." "Stupid," Vanessa laughed, but it was a humorless, hollow sound. "You don't get it, do you? I'm not going down for this, Michael. If that means taking drastic measures, so be it." Michael opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. He knew better than to push Vanessa when she was like this. Instead, he muttered a curt goodbye and hung up, his unease deepening. Grace's newfound alliance with Caroline began bearing fruit. By evening, Caroline presented her with a small folder filled with documents, bank statements, suspicious transactions, and cryptic messages between Vanessa and unnamed contacts. "This is just the tip of the iceberg," Caroline said, sliding the folder across the table. "But it's enough to start painting a picture." Grace flipped through the papers, her anger simmering as she connected the dots. "She's laundering money," she said, her voice low but resolute. "And using Michael as a cover." "Exactly," Caroline confirmed. "He's the perfect front, an upstanding lawyer with a spotless reputation." But Vanessa's overestimated her ability to keep things quiet. This trail wasn't hard to find. Grace closed the folder and looked up at Caroline. Determination etched across her face. "We need more. Enough to take her down and protect my family in the process." Caroline nodded. "Agreed, but we'll have to be careful. Vanessa's not one to play fair, and she's certainly not one to back down." Grace's stomach churred at the thought, but she pushed her fear aside. She'd come too far to stop now. Vanessa, however, wasn't taking chances. That evening, she met with an associate in a dimly lit parking garage. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating, his face partially hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. "They're getting too close," Vanessa said, her voice low but urgent. "I need you to handle it." The man raised an eyebrow. Handle it? You mean scare them off or— Vanessa hesitated, her mind racing. Just scare them, for now. But make it clear that if they don't back off there will be consequences. The man nodded. Consider it done. As Vanessa watched him walk away, a shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't sure if she was more afraid of what her associate might do or of what Grace and Caroline might uncover. The next day, Grace found an anonymous note slipped under her front door. It was hastily written, the handwriting jagged and uneven. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." She stared at the note, her hands trembling. Then, without a second thought, she folded it neatly and placed it in her pocket. When Caroline arrived an hour later, Grace handed her the note. "Looks like Vanessa's getting desperate," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Caroline read the note and smirked. "Good. Desperate people make mistakes," Grace nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's make sure her next mistake is her last." Unbeknownst to them, Vanessa was already planning her next move, one that would put Grace in greater danger than she could have ever anticipated. The day of the confrontation had arrived, and Grace had spent the last few days meticulously setting the stage for a public reckoning. She knew that Michael, with his charm and polished demeanor, would try to spin any confrontation into his favor, especially in private. But Grace had no intention of giving him that luxury. She was going to expose him, his affair, his deceit, and his involvement in much darker dealings, where there would be no escaping it. The venue was a stylish upscale restaurant downtown. It was a place frequented by influential professionals, a location where appearances mattered and secrets were difficult to keep. Grace had invited a carefully selected group of people, close family, some of Michael's professional colleagues, and even a few friends who knew Vanessa. Michael, oblivious to the trap she'd set, had no idea that this dinner would be his undoing. As the evening unfolded, the group mingled over cocktails, exchanging pleasantries. Michael stood in the corner, a glass of whiskey in hand, his expression stiff. Vanessa, seated at a table near him, gave an occasional laugh at the wrong moments, her eyes darting nervously around the room. She was pretending to be the confident, composed professional, but Grace could see through the cracks. Vanessa was already starting to lose her composure. Grace, who had been waiting for this moment for months, felt a sense of calm settling over her. She was no longer the worried wife or the betrayed woman. She was the one holding the reins now, and there was no turning back. She waited until the evening was well underway before making her move. "Excuse me," Grace said, standing up to address the room. The chatter quieted and every eye in the room turned to her. She gave a small, composed smile and continued, "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This is an important moment for us, as there are some things I need to share, things that affect us all." She glanced at Michael, who looked slightly alarmed but did his best to mask it. Vanessa, too, stiffened, her hand frozen in the middle of reaching for a drink. "I've invited you here tonight because we are all connected by a significant issue, an issue that involves trust, betrayal, and the truth," Grace continued, her voice measured and calm. "And tonight the truth is going to come out." Michael's face flushed, but he recovered quickly, putting on his usual mask of control. "Grace, this isn't necessary." "I think it is, Michael," Grace cut him off, her eyes hardening. "You see, I've known about the affair for some time. The late nights, the calls, the lies. But that's not all. There's more." She took a step forward, her gaze moving from Michael to Vanessa. "Tonight I'm not only exposing the affair," Grace said, her voice growing more resolute. "I'm exposing something much worse, something you both thought you could keep hidden." At that moment Caroline stood up from her seat, holding a folder in her hands. The eyes in the room shifted between the two women. Caroline was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to her presence. She handed the folder to Grace. "I think you all need to see this," Grace said as she opened the folder. She placed several printed documents on the table for everyone to see. Vanessa's eyes widened as Grace slid the first document into view. It was a contract, one that had Michael's name on it, alongside a number of financial transactions that didn't add up. "This is a business deal that Michael and Vanessa have been conspiring on," Grace said, her voice unwavering. "A deal that involves illegal financial activities, money laundering, fraud, and the use of Michael's law firm to cover it up. They thought they could hide it under the guise of legitimate business, but it's all here in black and white." The room fell silent, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Michael stood frozen, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. Vanessa's composure had completely shattered. "Where did you get this?" Michael finally stammered, his voice shaky. "I have my sources," Grace replied coolly. "But I think it's time for you to stop pretending, Michael. You've been using your profession to cover for Vanessa's schemes, while she used you as a pawn to further her own interests." Vanessa's face contorted with rage. She rose from her seat, her hand slamming down onto the table. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped, her voice cracking with emotion. "This isn't what it seems." Grace turned to her. "You've been lying to everyone, Vanessa. Using Michael for your own gain, using the law firm to cover up your shady dealings, and now you're trying to play the victim." Vanessa took a deep breath, attempting to regain control, but her trembling hands betrayed her. "You have no idea how deep this goes," she spat, her eyes narrowing at Grace. Grace raised an eyebrow. "Try me." For a moment, Vanessa seemed to hesitate. Then her eyes darted to Michael. There was a brief flash of something. A look of fear, of desperation. Then, in that moment, she made a critical mistake. "You don't know everything," Vanessa hissed, leaning in close enough that everyone could hear. "You think Michael's the victim here. He's as much a part of this as I am. He's the one who—" Before she could finish her sentence, Michael snapped, his face contorting with anger. "Shut up," he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The room was silent, every person there realizing that something far darker was at play than they had been led to believe. Vanessa had inadvertently revealed something that Grace hadn't known. The extent of Michael's involvement, his willingness to risk everything, including his family, for power and profit. Grace's eyes narrowed as she processed the new information. She had suspected Michael's complicity, but hearing Vanessa confirm it so carelessly made her stomach twist in a way that no amount of planning could have prepared her for. She turned back to face Michael, her gaze icy. "So tell me, Michael," she said, her voice cold and controlled. "How deep does this go? What else have you been hiding?" Michael took a step back, his face pale, his eyes darting around the room, looking for a way out. But there was no escape. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. Vanessa, defeated and desperate, glanced at the door. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'll regret this." But Grace stood tall, unwavering. "The only thing I regret," she said, her voice steady, "is not confronting this sooner." As the room stood in stunned silence, Grace knew this was just the beginning. The web of lies and betrayal had been exposed, and now it was only a matter of time before it all unraveled completely. The dust had barely settled after the explosive confrontation at the restaurant when the full weight of the consequences began to sink in. Michael's attempts to salvage his reputation were feeble at best. In the weeks that followed, he tried every avenue. Hiring crisis management firms, leaking a carefully constructed statement to the press, and even going so far as to plead for forgiveness from close friends and family. But it was too late. The damage was done, and his carefully crafted facade had crumbled. The affair, the fraudulent business dealings, and the lies about his relationship with Vanessa were no longer rumors whispered behind closed doors. They were facts, indisputable and irrefutable. Michael's colleagues, once loyal, began to distance themselves. The partners in his law firm who had turned a blind eye to his actions could no longer afford to associate with him. The legal consequences of his involvement in the shady business deal were imminent, and his career, which had once been his pride, was now in jeopardy. Despite his mounting desperation, Michael's reputation was irreparably tainted. The public eye had been opened, and there was no unseeing what had been exposed. It was his own doing. There was no one left to blame but himself. Grace, however, moved forward with a clear mind. She had long known that the hardest part was the realization of betrayal, the emotional toll it took to confront the truth. But once that weight had been lifted, she found herself standing tall again, stronger than before. The divorce proceedings were swift, though not without their own complexities. Grace had taken every step with care, ensuring she was fully protected both financially and emotionally. The legal battle was one Michael could not win, not with the evidence stacked against him. She had no intention of making the process harder than it needed to be, but Michael had made it clear he would fight tooth and nail for the life he once had. Yet even as the divorce was finalized, Michael's efforts were futile. His actions caught up with him quickly. His legal troubles worsened as more details about his involvement with Vanessa's schemes came to light. While Grace was legally separated from him, the real punishment for his misdeeds came in the form of charges and lawsuits that he could not avoid. Vanessa, the architect of much of the chaos, had vanished. No one knew exactly where she had gone, but her disappearance only added to the mystery. Some speculated that she had fled to a new city, others that she had taken a completely different path, one far from the world she had once controlled with her manipulations. No matter where she went, it was clear that the trail of devastation she had left behind would haunt her. Her relationships had been shattered, trust had been broken beyond repair, and her ambition had led her to a lonely end. Grace did not mourn for Vanessa. She mourned for the woman who had once trusted, who had loved, and who had believed in the vows of marriage. the woman who had hoped her family could withstand anything. In a sense, Grace was grieving for the woman she used to be, the one whose heart was still soft, whose eyes hadn't yet seen the world for what it truly was. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder, more wary, but it was a version of herself she could live with, even respect. As time passed, Grace began to rebuild her life piece by piece. The house that had once felt like a prison became a sanctuary. She transformed the rooms into spaces that reflected her new sense of independence and peace. She started working with organizations that focused on empowering women in situations similar to hers, using her own story as a beacon of hope for those in need. The more she gave, the more she healed. And through it all, the witness, Caroline, remained a quiet, steadfast ally. She had been part of the darker chapter of Grace's story, but she was also instrumental in bringing it all to light. Caroline's own life had been marked by secrets and regrets, but Grace's actions had provided her with the chance to right some of those wrongs. In a quiet moment one evening, Caroline visited Grace. They sat together on the porch, the soft hum of nightfall settling around them. The sky was beginning to fade to a deep purple, and the stars slowly appeared, scattered across the expanse like glitter. "Thank you," Caroline said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was laced with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. "I can't undo the things I did before, but you gave me a chance to help make it right." Grace turned to her, offering a small smile. "You did the right thing, Caroline. I couldn't have done it without you." Caroline nodded, her eyes briefly misting with emotion. She had no illusions about the past, but she could now look forward with a sense of resolution. As Caroline stood to leave, Grace placed a hand on her arm. "You know," she said softly, "I think we both learned something through all this, that we're stronger than we give ourselves credit for." Caroline gave her a knowing smile before walking down the path and disappearing into the night. Grace stood there for a long time, taking in the quiet beauty of the evening, the sense of peace that had gradually settled within her. The pain of betrayal had subsided, replaced by something stronger: empowerment, independence, and a quiet understanding of her own worth. The future was uncertain, but Grace was no longer afraid. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of possibility stirring in her chest. The world was wide open now, and she had the power to choose what came next. The life she had once feared losing was now behind her, and the woman she had become was unbreakable. And as the stars twinkled above, Grace knew that the worst was over. She was finally free. And there you have it, the story of betrayal, deception, and a woman who took control of her life when everything seemed to be falling apart. Grace's courage in exposing the truth and reclaiming her power shows just how important it is to trust your instincts and take action when things don't feel right. But this isn't just Grace's story, it's a reminder that sometimes the truth is the most powerful weapon we have. What do you think? How would you have handled a situation like this? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more gripping tales of betrayal, secrets, and triumph, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have any thoughts or experiences you'd like to share, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay strong and keep seeking the truth.